Well, we're going to keep the movement moving on here, and we want to turn now to Kenya and some other, I think, related Pan-African affairs that are centered in many ways on Kenya, at least to some degree. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Booker Omole, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party Marxist Kenya. Booker, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Eugene, and it's a pleasure to come through to the Breakthrough News to at least analyze the situation in Kenya and try to relate it with the global imperialist crisis. And just because I've also observed the situation in Gaza, probably I could take this moment to say that the Kenyan people, the African people, pass their unconditional and solidarity with the people in Gaza. And of course, our defiance against settler colonialism, our defiance against Zionism, and will continue to march, and Palestinian people will emerge victorious.
Thank you for saying that. And I think it's an important point to start on. And I think helps segue into my first question for you, which is an interesting one about where Kenya is now and some of the role it's playing, in the world and of course around the continent. There's a lot happening in Africa around the recent support from the Ruto government for the RSF in Sudan, very much against, I think, what many Sudanese people, certainly in Sudan and the diaspora, are in favor of, and seemingly stoking the flames and the fire of the civil war there even further. I think a lot of people who aren't in Kenya were a little surprised to see this, especially since Mr. Hemditi seemed to be losing support all around the continent. But given how prominent Sudan is as a massive crisis around the world, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is behind Kenya's support here, or at least seeming support for the RSF?
First of all, it's important to understand that during the struggle for liberation in the African continent, many liberation movements had been shortchanged. And now we have the neocolonial compromises. And Kenya is a perfect case where we have a neocolonial entity because we achieved a political independence to replace the white person by a black man. But at the very end of it, we did not change the colonial structures. So President William Samoei Ruto is part of the rented leaders in the African continent that continues to advance imperialism. In fact, the crisis that we are seeing in Kenya today, just like in many African countries, is the crisis of imperialism. Now, when we come to Sudan, I am ashamed that my government, the Kenyan government, have always, since independence, been on the wrong side of history. Maybe your viewers also should know that the Kenyan government supported apartheid against the South African people. You should also know that now that we are discussing about Palestine, the Kenyan government gave the Zionist entity an entire airport to bomb Uganda. So it basically means that the Kenyan government has always been alienated from the majority of the Kenyan people, and they don't have a foreign policy. In fact, in the Communist Party Marxist, we've always said that the current government, as a neocolonial government, do not have a clear foreign policy based on principle. President William Samoei Ruto summed up his policy, the foreign policy, as economic diplomacy. This basically means that he has no principle. He only wants to relate with any country dependent on what he can materially get from them. He wants to prostitute our country to any person with resources. This is important. Remember, even before Sudan, we already have, the problem in Western Sahara. When Morocco did what was called the fertilizer diplomacy and bribed President William Samoei Ruto and close, political leaders here in our country, the Western Sahara was threatened, and even their diplomatic status in our country was threatened. until the Kenyan people took up to challenge this illegal initiative that was being spearheaded by William Samoei Ruto. When it came to Sudan, we have a history, particularly in the Communist Party Marxist, that we have been hosting Sudanese refugees and the members of the Sudanese Communist Party that are in Kenya. And the Kenyan majority supports the true liberation of Sudan. In fact, even when Sudan was won, Garang de Mabur was one of the most revered and darling leaders in the in Kenya as a country. But now, President William Samoei Ruto has changed that trajectory. He wants to pal around terrorists. He wants to pal around the leader of the Janjaweed that has massacred a lot of people in particularly Darfur. Now, it is not the first time that the leader of Hemedi is coming to Kenya. He has been here before. But we know that Kenya is being used as a conduit to steal gold from Sudan. Kenya is being used as a conduit to smuggle Sudanese gold. This is what President William Samoei Ruto is facilitating. There is no diplomacy. There is no search for peace. Every deal that William Samoei Ruto has done in the Eastern African continent, from Sudan to Congo, it's all been about the deal of plunder and nothing that resembles any concrete foreign policy.
That's really the looting of gold that you just described is really interesting. I'm curious if you could elaborate a bit on the broader implications of essentially Kenya legitimizing the RSF through this kind of like diplomatic engagement, which you're saying isn't really diplomatic engagement, but particularly in the context of foreign influence and this kind of use of warlords to advance imperialist interests in Africa.
This friendship of William Samoei Ruto and Hemedi was brokered by UAE. Now, UAE has been sponsoring the Janjaweed militia to destabilize Sudan, steal its gold, and massacre people, particularly sponsoring ethnic cleansing. When President William Samoei Ruto even went to visit Washington, they shared the same plane with Hemedi from Nairobi to Washington. This plane was sponsored by the UAE. Now, again, we are seeing the continuous collaboration between the Janjaweed militia, the UAE, and President William Samoei Ruto. And we must never forget that when we went to the streets during the most popular pro-people uprising in our country known as the Gen Z uprising, Janjaweed were actually allowed to come to our country illegally to kill innocent youth. So basically the cooperation is just beyond economic, but also to sustain the neocolonial government that is within the East African region. This partnership that involves using warlords to massacre, to carry out genocide, to steal from the African continent has been perfected by the United States imperialism. In fact, for them, they do not want to loot directly. So they want to get criminals like Ruto to rent them to do their dirty work. This is what has continues to happen in the Kenyan today. Remember, only 3 weeks ago, we issued a statement to condemn the parallel government. And that even it made the Sudanese government. But how do you give a militia to organize a parallel government in a government institution and even offer them security to come to plan their own terrorist activities to destabilize another sovereign country? In our own opinion, the primary enemy is this neocolonial government. The primary enemy is indeed the managers of this neocolonial government that continues to rob their people in the interest of imperialism. Gold is just one of them. Congo is no longer even a growing concern anymore. But we must continue to put the resistance to expose the puppets of imperialism in Africa.
Well, I think that's a good point because it seems to speak, at least from an outsider looking in, to a lot of what we're seeing in the political system there in Kenya to react to the power of the Gen Z uprising. We're seeing people rebrand their parties and try to shuffle around alliances. And it seems very much to present a false front because there is such a powerful uprising. So talk to us, if you could, about where that stands, because it does feel that the echoes of the Gen Z uprising are continuing to shape the political face of the country.
The science of history is that wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. As the oppression intensifies, resistance also intensifies. The militancy and politicization of all spaces, particularly in major cities in Nairobi, are challenging the status quo every day. Even as I'm in the interview today, yesterday alone, there was even more militant offensive against the police in Majengo that ended up burning the entire police station and even burning the police houses after one of the young people were extrajudicially killed. But this realignment that is taking place is that the crisis of imperialism, the only thing that the agents of imperialism in our country are hiding the crisis, the source of the crisis. They do not want to address the source of crisis. The young people are asking for jobs. They are looking for dignity. They're asking for work. They are on the streets to defend their life. But the ruling class are using the old tactics to neutralize the uprising in the street. And that is common to them. For example, President William Samoei Ruto has formed what is called a broad-based government with the opposition. Just because the opposition, they pretend to disagree, but their disagreement is not concrete. They only disagree on who has looted more than the other. So the realignment that is taking place is that the political class, the comprado class, are consolidating their power and then dividing the majority of the poor working class along the tribal lines. This is the consolidation that is taking place. Even the Liberation Party of Kenya by Martha Karua is still just another face to actually lie to the Kenyan masses that you can talk about liberation while you are part of the same problem that is still looking for solutions outside Kenya. It will annoy you because every time we have a crisis in these countries, the ruling class are calling out external intervention. President William Samoei Ruto used to call Joe Biden at that time to intervene in the Kenyan affairs. The former Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga always call on what they call the Commonwealth countries to intervene in our affairs. Martha Karua, the same, that is now rebranding to say that is representing the Gen Z, is part of the problem. So the minority criminals are only able to dominate these countries through this politics of deception, division, xenophobia, tribalism, because they want to hide the real cause of the crisis in this country. But for us, we are clear that as long as the people of Kenya remains poor, as long as the working class continue to be exploited and suffer on the weight of austerity measures that are imposed by World Bank and IMF, as long as imperialism continues to intensify by interfering with the livelihood of the workers, trying to privatize healthcare, privatize education, then the imperialism crisis can only intensify. Even though we have lost so many comrades in the streets, every day it's death, tomorrow another death. But the reassurance that we have today, that it has also given us opportunities to reconsolidate our party, to build it even in a much stronger way, and to confront the forces of status quo. This is why we say that Kenya, at the moment, it's actually the lighting point where the imperialism will suffer the greatest dent in East Africa. So we have to continue to say to the Kenyan people and to the world that imperialism, even though it hides in different colors, it hides in different, but it has no color. It only has interest. It want to exploit the local population. It want to, it want to reinforce its exploitation. But all this is happening on the back of the poor working class. This is the crisis that we are facing in our country today. And even though the Communist Party Marxist has been a beneficiary in terms of recruiting members and reconsolidating our ranks, the price has been huge. But also, we know that victory is coming soon. And this is why we will continue to expand our organization to expose these big bureaucratic capitalists, the comprado class, the rented small crowd that continues to manage the Kenyan project only in the interest of foreign capital and foreign interest. I think the biggest problem we've had in this country is that we have never clearly defined the character of our struggle. But today, the majority of the Kenyan people understand that we've experienced a sham independence. We must continue to carry out the unfinished revolution that was taken up by the Mau Mau, Deda and Kimathi, and bring it to life by making sure that we can complete this process and bring the Kenyan project back to the Kenyan people. Because without economic independence, there is no sovereignty. And without sovereignty, there is no free men and women. In that case, we must fight for the economic independence, even to lay the firmest basis in which we will start the most urgent task, which is socialist construction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think very important points all across the board there, and obviously a very important struggle happening in Kenya. Booker, as always, we really appreciate you. Booker Omole, General Secretary of the Communist Party Marxist of Kenya. Happy to have you here, and we'll be happy to have you back in the future as the struggle unfolds.
Thank you.